Hello and welcome to the National Museum of Scotland. My name is David Forsyth and I'm a Principal Curator in the Scottish History and Archaeology Department. It's my great privilege today to show you around this wonderful building. Here we like to say we have the world under one roof. The National Museum of Scotland is a multidisciplinary museum. We cover all subjects: natural sciences, science and technology, art and design, and of course Scottish history itself. This wonderful building was opened in 1866. It's a Victorian building. You can see the amazing range of objects that we have here at National Museum of Scotland. Behind me we have the window in the world. This shows the great breadth and depth of the collections here. Collections you can see in one visit and one day. As I said, it's like the world under one roof. There are some 20,000 objects on display over 40 galleries in this building. The building was opened in the 19th century, and next door in the Scotland Galleries, opened in 1998, we show the story of those who lived and worked in Scotland right back to the times of prehistory up until the very present day. We're now standing in the Grand Gallery of the National Museum of Scotland. This is really a building devoted to the cultures of the world, to science and technology, to innovation. But look at the breadth of the objects we have here. Here we have a Buddha Amida from Japan. We have a feast bowl from the Pacific Islands. We have examples of Scottish engineering, that beautiful cover for a drinking fountain. And right down at the bottom, one of the giants of Scottish technology, Scottish innovation, James Watt, the man who harnessed steam. And behind me here in this window in the world, this shows the very rich, deep and varied collections we have here at the National Museums of Scotland. Again, more objects from Asia. A gyrocopter, pottery from Iran, spanners and tools that were used in Scotland during the Industrial Revolution when Scotland became the workshop of the world. A lighthouse at the very foot, a lighthouse lens. Here you can see the real depth. Looking there we can also see a whale skeleton, the head of a sperm whale, which was washed up on the shores of the River Forth close to Edinburgh some years ago. So really the National Museum of Scotland is the world under one roof. Natural science, world cultures, science and technology, art and design, and of course the Scottish Histories Galleries next door, where we look at the experience of those who lived in Scotland from prehistory right up until the present day. It's a tremendous place to come and visit. We hope you'd enjoy it. We'll move towards a feast bowl which comes from the Pacific Islands, showing the reach and the connection of Scots, because this is how these collections came to the National Museum. Many Scots travelled abroad as commercial agents, as soldiers, as missionaries. And they brought back objects from these places, these countries of the 5 continents that they visited. We see other examples of decorative arts and the skill and output of Scotland in the 19th century. This wonderful cast iron drinking fountain cover here in the green and gold, an example of the beautiful work that could be produced. This museum first opened to the public in 1866. It was called the Museum of Science and Art, hoping to showcase the very best of Scottish production at the time, but also looking at the cultures, the output of other peoples. Here we have a printing press that was used to print museum labels right up until the mid-20th century. And at the very end we have a statue of one of the great giants of Scottish innovation, James Watt, the Scot who harnessed steam. Really this museum is a showcase also of some of the great innovations and inventions that have been made in Scotland. This small country, but an impact which has been hugely felt across the world. And next door we move towards science and technology. Some of the modern technological advances, from of course that great innovation, the first cloned mammal, Dolly the Sheep, to racing cars. And beyond that we go back in time to look at Scottish history, from prehistory, from the very first peoples who came to Scotland, right up into the present day, looking at those who have chosen to live in Scotland and those who work in Scotland. So indeed, the National Museum of Scotland is very much the world under one roof, where we're able to show the world to Scotland, and of course with Scottish history displays, Scotland to the world. We're now in the Discoveries Gallery, and this is one of the reasons why the National Museum of Scotland is the most visited museum in the United Kingdom outside of London. This museum, and this gallery in particular, showcases the ideas, skills and leadership, the innovation and inventiveness of the Scots, an inventiveness that's been felt across the world. Some of the most famous inventions of the 20th century were discovered and made in Scotland, including John Logie Baird and the television in the 1920s, when in 1928 the first colour pictures were transmitted. And of course that great gift to the world from Scotland by Sir Alexander Fleming, the great scientist who discovered penicillin. These displays here show the range of the cultures that Scots have interacted with, from Africa to Asia. Scots travelled the world as missionaries, as colonial administrators, as soldiers, and they often brought these objects back. And they're showcased here in this Discoveries Gallery. I'm now going to take you on a short tour of the Discoveries Gallery, where we showcase some of the great treasures of our collections and also some of the evidence of the inventiveness and innovation of Scots. Behind me on my left hand side here, we have a case devoted to one of the most famous Scots of the 19th century, David Livingstone. Now, David Livingstone was a Scottish missionary who went to Africa, and he fought tirelessly against the slave trade in Africa. And he's one of the few Europeans that's remembered and celebrated within Africa. But look at some of the objects that Scots brought back with them. Here's a mummy from Egypt. Now, the man who collected this mummy wasn't a professional Egyptologist. He was an engineer who was involved with the irrigation schemes in the Nile. Colin Scott Moncrieff was so celebrated and famous within Egypt that he was called the prefect of the Nile and was given a pension by the Egyptian government when he left to return to Scotland at the end of the 19th century. Scotland was famous for its Enlightenment ideas of the 18th century. This was an attempt to find practical ways of solving some of the problems of the world. Here we have some scientific instruments associated with Joseph Black, the Scottish chemist who discovered the theory of latent heat. And also we have a thermometer which was made in the workshop of James Watt, the man who discovered the ability to harness the power of steam. And here on my left, we show the impact that Sir Alexander Fleming and his wonderful invention of penicillin has had. We have a selection of the many medals and orders that were given to him, including, of course, the Nobel Prize for Physiology in 1945. Here we have a case devoted to Sir Alexander Fleming. Now, Sir Alexander Fleming is one of the most influential and famous Scots of the 20th century. By accident, he discovered penicillin. He found a bacteria, a mould growing in some plates that he had left behind in his laboratory. There he realised that this mould could probably help cure infection, and from there on in, antibiotics came about. He was given the Nobel Prize, which you can see this beautiful gold medal, for medicine in 1945, jointly with another group of scientists. Fleming is remembered and celebrated throughout the world, and you can also see behind me on my left hand side some of the many medals and awards that were given to Sir Alexander Fleming over the years. Often you find in Spanish towns and cities there's a calle, a street, named after Alexander Fleming. Such was the importance of this man. It is interesting that this little medal, the Nobel Prize, that Fleming went to an ordinary public school in Scotland, Kilmarnock Academy, and we have another Nobel Prize in the school by another boy who also went to Kilmarnock Academy. This just shows the level of inventiveness and invention can be found in Scotland, which is a relatively small country. I've mentioned that many Scots travelled across the globe. This case here looks at a parrying shield. Now that is a shield used by the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. It was collected by Sir Thomas MacDougall Brisbane. Brisbane was the Governor-General of New South Wales in present-day Australia at the start of the 19th century. Now, not just being a colonial administrator, Brisbane also established the first observatory in the Southern Hemisphere. The parrying shield was one of the earliest objects to come into our collections. He also gave a war canoe to the connection. MacDougall Brisbane is a good example of the many Scots whose objects have been collected abroad and then have come to the museum as donations. It shows this great spread that the Scots had, even in the early 19th century, reaching as far as the Southern Hemisphere, as far as the continent of Australia. This amazing Iroquois ball-headed club was given to a Scottish colonial governor, James Bruce, the Earl of Elgin. Interesting for the Chinese audience, Elgin also served in China, but this came from the time when he was Governor-General of Canada in the 19th century. This was probably given to him as a diplomatic gift by the First Nations people of the Iroquois. It shows that the high regard that James Bruce was held in. He was well respected in Canada because Canada was made up of both English and French-speaking peoples. And Bruce went a long way to try and bring peace between these peoples who had previously been at enmity with each other. This just shows the huge impact and reach that Scots have had in the world. And thankfully, these wonderful objects, when they return to Scotland, have become part of the collections of National Museum of Scotland. We've now reached the Scotland Galleries. This was the extension built in the museum in 1998. It was the first time that a purpose-built building had been built to house the Scottish collections. From the bottom floor up to the top floor in level 7, we look at Scotland from prehistory right up to the present day. I'm here now though in the very key gallery, the Kingdom of the Scots Gallery, which looks at the development of medieval Scotland. Scotland from about 1100 round about to 1750. This tells the story of Scotland's attempts to remain its independence against its southern neighbour England, and looks at some of the very fine developments of art and decorative arts that were made in Scotland at this time. It's a very important time in Scottish history, where the Scots fought to retain this independence from the larger power south in England. And we have some of our real treasures of the National Museum of Scotland that can be found in these galleries. We're now going to look at an object which is probably or a group of objects which is probably very familiar to many of the viewers. And that is the Lewis Chessmen. These beautifully carved little chess pieces, but I'm sure many of the viewers may think they've seen these before. And they would be right. These, of course, are the chess pieces that appeared in the Harry Potter films. Now, these weren't actually made in Scotland, but were made probably in Trondheim in Norway at the end of the 12th century. They're made carved from walrus, tusk, or even sperm whale tusk. They show a glimpse of the Viking world. The Vikings were not all about raiding and plundering, but show a very sophisticated material culture that grew up around the Vikings. There's a bit of a mystery around them because they were found in a hole in the ground in the island of Lewis on the west coast of Scotland at the beginning of the 19th century. They may have been left there by a trader, we really don't know. Like many of the key objects in the museum, sometimes the history is obscured. We then move to this lovely clarsach. Now, a clarsach is the Gaelic word for a harp, which has long been associated with Mary Queen of Scots, one of Scotland's most famous queens and certainly one of the most famous Scotswomen in the world. This was probably made in the mid-15th century and was actually the national instrument of Scotland before the more famous bagpipes that people are maybe more familiar with today. It has beautiful examples of Celtic decorative art on it, and is certainly one of the treasures of the National Museum. One of the key features of these galleries is that we look at the growing sense of Scottish nationhood, of Scottish national identity. And one of the great icons of that, of course, is Scotland's patron saint. And here we have St Andrew. This is a statue of St Andrew, which was carved in about 1500. In the 16th century, Scotland went through a great reformation in religion, and many of the religious carvings and icons were lost at that time when people tried to return the church back to what they called a reformed or purer state. This statue of St Andrew survived that period, so it's a rare indication of religious life and work before the Reformation of 1560. Thinking more of Mary Queen of Scots, we're walking down this wonderful gallery which shows the connection of Scotland in the Renaissance period. Scotland was very connected with Europe. It wasn't an insular country, we often think of Scotland as being rather austere and grey and dour, to use a good Scots word. But here we can see these wonderful wood carvings on either side of the room, which show this connection with Europe. The Renaissance was at full spate in Europe at the time, and Scots were affected by these developments in Europe. Here we see this beautiful Renaissance jewel, the Fetter Canoe jewel, which is one of the most recent acquisitions to the collections of National Museum of Scotland. This gorgeous jewel shows that Scotland did compete with Northern Europe in terms of artistry and development. Again, there's many mysteries about this jewel, and currently we're researching the history of it, going through the papers of the family, of Scots landowning family, aristocratic family, who had it in their possession. Taking on the subject of jewels, we move back to Mary Queen of Scots, who's possibly, as I've said, one of the most famous Scotswomen in the world. Mary became Queen of Scots as a mere infant on the death of her father, James V. She was taken off to France as a child of about 5 years of age and returned to Scotland in 1561 to take up the crown for herself. Here we have some very important items of jewellery which are connected with Mary Queen of Scots. This shows that Scotland wasn't necessarily a poor country. The Scottish monarchy was rich. Mary came back in 1561 when her young husband, the Dauphin of France, died, and these jewels were in her possession. Now, the story of Mary is very tempestuous and complicated, but effectively, after about 7 years on the throne of Scotland, she was deposed by those who opposed her, supporters of her son. These wonderful Renaissance jewels were kept in her possession during their captivity by her cousin Elizabeth I of England in England. She was executed in February 1587, and the jewels in the middle here, the necklace and the little pendant jewel, were given to one of her supporters. These show the exquisite nature of jewellery at the time, but also say something of Mary's private life, her personal devotion as a very devout Catholic. It's thought that number 2 here, the beads, were probably part of a rosary. They would have contained ambergris, the oil of the sperm whale, to allow devotion at the time. And also, there's a rather mysterious little portrait locket here, which contains a picture of a woman and a young man. Now, Mary didn't see her son James after he was 10 months old. So one of the theories is that this is a jewel that represents James and Mary, the son, who never really knew his mother. We move on to this amazing carved marble copy of the tomb of Mary Queen of Scots, which is now in the Westminster Abbey in London. James had been brought up to believe that Mary had murdered his father, Lord Darnley, and he had a very difficult relationship with the memory of his mother. But in 1612, he had his mother exhumed from her place of burial after an execution at Peterborough Cathedral and brought to London and buried with the full pomp and circumstance of a queen. The irony of this, of course, is that Mary had always wanted to be Queen of England, but her final resting place was to be at the very heart of the English monarchy, Westminster Abbey itself. Now, not everything in Scottish history is pretty, and I want to finish off with this amazing object behind me. It's called the Maiden. It's the Scottish equivalent of the French guillotine. It's an instrument of capital punishment used to behead criminals. It was brought into Scotland in the 16th century. Indeed, it is said that the man who brought it to Scotland, the Earl of Bothwell, was actually executed on it himself. The Maiden was used to execute traitors, criminals in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was then stored in the jail, the Edinburgh town jail, and not used for many years. What's interesting about the Maiden is, though, the time that it came into the collection of National Museum of Scotland, and that was in the 18th century, at the time of the French Revolution. Now, we don't have any written evidence for this, but we think that possibly someone has discovered the Maiden in the depths of the dungeons of Edinburgh, thought about the events that were taking place in France at the time in the 18th century, when King Louis XIV and King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had their heads chopped off on the French guillotine. So it's been in the National Museum ever since, to show that the museum shows the stories of Scotland, both the good, the beautiful, the lovely jewellery, and of course these instruments of torture. We're now going to introduce you to some of the earlier objects in the museum. You're going to find the story behind Scotland's precious metal, silver.
there, my name is Alice Blackwell and I'm the Glenmorangie Research Fellow here at National Museum of Scotland, and I co-curated the exhibition that we're standing in now, which is called Scotland's Early Silver. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. This exhibition runs until the 25th of February in 2018, and it's a really exciting project to have worked on. It covers the first 1,000 years of silver use in Scotland. Silver was a brand new material that arrived in Scotland with the Roman army, and for the first time we've been able to use some exciting new discoveries and also some new research on iconic old objects to tell this story of what was the most precious material in Scotland at the time. This is a time in the first millennium AD, so from the 1st century AD to the end of the 10th century AD, when silver was much more important than gold. We think today of gold as being the gold standard. People win gold medals, things are the gold standard, but this is a time when silver was much more important, more valued, and the main way in which people showed and measured their power and their prestige. So we're showcasing some of the National Museum of Scotland's archaeology collections. Our collections from the medieval period run really from the 5th century to the 15th century, but we have collections much wider than that that span the earliest prehistoric times right up to the present day. I'm going to give you a tour of the exhibition and show you some of my favourite objects. But first of all, I wanted to explain my job title, Glenmorangie Research Fellow. That's quite an interesting job title to have. So as I said, my job title is Glenmorangie Research Officer, and we're very grateful to the Glenmorangie Company, the Scottish malt whisky company, for their generous support of both this exhibition but also the research that's gone into it. Actually, the National Museum of Scotland and Glenmorangie have had a really innovative partnership since 2008, which has supported brand new archaeological research on a really formative part of Scotland's past, the early medieval period, which runs roughly from about the 5th century to the 10th or 11th centuries AD. So we're really grateful for Glenmorangie's support, but why, I guess, have they joined us in this innovative partnership? Well, it's because their brand logo took inspiration from a piece of early medieval carved stone from the north of Scotland in our collections, the Hilton of Cadboll stone. It's one of our iconic objects, and they decided to use it as inspiration for their new brand logo. Here in our book on early medieval Scotland, you can see a detail of the stone that they used as inspiration. We also have a new book out that runs alongside this exhibition called Scotland's Early Silver, and you can buy both that and early medieval Scotland online if you're interested and want to learn out more. So, welcome to Scotland's Early Silver. We're going to look at the first 1,000 years of silver, as I said, and the earliest silver known in Scotland arrived with the Roman period. Scotland has its own geological sources of silver, but they weren't exploited until the medieval period, almost 1,000 years later than we're talking here. So in this case here, you can see some of the very earliest silver objects ever found in Scotland. They're Roman, they belong to the 1st century AD, and they are coins and some very high status jewellery. There aren't many of these objects. This is a brand new material for Scotland, but part of how the Roman Empire paid people. The coins were soldiers' pay, but also how people showed their status and their importance. These brooches would have been worn by really important officers. But by and large, this silver is Roman silver for Roman people. It's found inside Roman forts. So this is a brand new material, but it's not really having a massive impact on Scotland yet. But that changes as we see a flood of silver payments in coins arriving north of the Roman frontier into Iron Age Scotland. This was the Roman Empire using silver as a geopolitical tool. It's Roman foreign policy we can see here. The Roman Empire is interfering with people beyond its borders. It's giving silver to some and not to others. It's trying to buy allies, buy peace, and create discord amongst the peoples north of its frontier. It had tried just conquering them. When that didn't work, it switched to a policy of power and persuasion. And silver's the main material they used to achieve this in Scotland. So here we see coin hoards from the north of Scotland. But a key change came when Roman payments beyond the frontier switched from coins to something called hack silver. And here we have a really good example of Roman hack silver. This hack silver is exactly what it says in the name. It's chopped up objects, objects that are being valued no longer for their art, for their beautiful decoration, but simply for their weight in bullion. It's only the weight of silver that's important now. Now this hoard is a new discovery. It was found 2 years ago by a 14-year-old boy who was using a metal detector in a field with his dad in Fife, and they found the first few fragments of this hoard of late 3rd century Roman hack silver. And this is an internationally significant discovery. It's really changed the story of Scotland's early silver, and I'll show you why. So the hoard comprises 4 vessels. You can see parts of each of them here. We have a rolled up cylinder that used to be a plate at the back, which is in the process of being converted into silver for another use. We have parts of a platter with a beaded rim that have been chopped roughly into quarters and folded up. And we have 2 parcels here from what was originally a beautiful fluted basin used for washing hands at Roman feasts. And we have fragments from an incredibly decorative but also very delicate silver cup at the back. And that's a really good object to start on, because although this hoard had been hacked into pieces by the Roman Empire, the damage we're dealing with is far greater than that, because as well as that hacking, it had been smashed by the plough after being buried in the ground, smashed by the plough into 400 fragments. So over the last few months, we've had a team of experts, curators and conservators working on what is really a silver jigsaw puzzle to stick some of these vessels back together so that we can understand how they originally looked, but also really importantly for us, how they had been chopped up into regular portions and parcels. Now this is the first time that this hoard of silver has ever been on public display. And I said it was internationally significant. And the reason for that is that it's now the earliest evidence from anywhere in Europe beyond the frontier for this sort of Roman policy, for this shift away from coins to hacked up silver. It pulls this part of our story in Scotland back 100 years, earlier than we previously thought, but it's also important for understanding Roman policy and Roman economy and throughout the empire. It's an absolutely astounding hoard, and we're really, really pleased to be able to have it on display here. As well as the earliest Roman hack silver from anywhere in Europe, we also have the largest hoard of Roman hack silver from anywhere in Europe. And that was found in East Lothian, a hill fort called Treprain Law, which you can see an image of behind us here, a really imposing part of the landscape of East Lothian. Now this is, like Desi, this is a hoard of hacked up Roman silver. Some beautiful, beautiful objects here, but being valued again for their weight in silver. This is 23 kilograms, not all shown here, some is on display in our permanent galleries. 23 kilograms of hacked up Roman silver, bullion that was made to be chopped up and recycled, turned into new objects. And that's the reason really that both of these hack silver hoards are important for Scotland, because the earlier coins had not been melted down. They were a new material for Scotland, but not one that was yet thought of as a raw material. They were used to show off and buried in the ground, whereas this hack silver, hoards like this and the example we've just seen, were made to be recycled. And it's thanks to these hoards that we have the first evidence in Scotland for silver being reworked, recycled, and for the first making of silver objects in Scotland itself. We can see some absolutely beautiful Roman things here, including my favourite, the 2 panther handles that would have originally adorned a beautiful flagon or jug and been used to pick it up. At the end of this case, we also have something which looks far less impressive but is really important. There's a little ceramic vessel at the back here, and that is a crucible. Now that crucible was found at Traprainlaw, the same site that produced this hack silver treasure, but vitally it has traces of melted silver on the inside. It's amongst the earliest evidence we have for silver being reworked and reused in Scotland. So the Romans had brought silver. It was a brand new material, it was exotic, it was tied up with the power and with the relationship with the Roman Empire. And it rapidly became the main way in which people in Scotland showed their prestige and their status. It carried all of these connotations of politics and Roman imperial power. And this same silver, this Roman hack silver, was recycled and recycled and recycled and recycled and made into generations of powerful objects in Scotland itself. And in a minute we can see some of the most impressive examples of what this silver was made into. After the end of the Roman Empire in the West in the 5th century AD, Scotland had a problem. It had begun to depend on Roman silver for its supplies, but equally those payments now dried up, and that meant that recycling became even more important. So here we have two examples of hack silver hoards that span that transition between the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the early medieval period. And these are really important because before we undertook research, thanks to the Glenmorangie Research Project, on these hoards, we really didn't have evidence for recycling in that crucial transition period. So we've got two hoards of hack silver that span that really difficult transition between the late Roman and the early medieval period, so around the 5th to early 6th century AD. And it's a time where we don't have as much archaeological evidence to tell us about changes or indeed continuity in Scotland at that time. But thanks to one new discovery and new research on an old find, we have two hoards of hack silver that really fill that important gap. So in the 19th century, silver was discovered in Aberdeenshire, a place called Gall Cross, when people were destroying 2 stone circles with dynamite in order that they could farm the field in which they were located. And during that process of destruction, they found a hoard of silver. You can see at the back 3 objects: a pin, a chain, and a bangle, a spiral bangle. And those were the only objects that survived from this 19th century discovery at Gall Cross. We know that a much bigger hoard was found, but as was usual for the time, a lot of the silver was melted down and recycled, turned into spoons or plates or vases. We had these 3 objects surviving, but we weren't sure what kind of a hoard they came from until we did some excavation. We reconstructed where those objects had been found and revisited, did an archaeological excavation and used a metal detector to systematically record what those 19th century labourers had missed. And what we found are these objects displayed in front, another 90 fragments of hack silver. Now this dramatically changes what kind of a hoard Gall Cross was. No longer does it look like a hoard of complete objects. It's clearly a hoard in the process of being chopped up and recycled. But everything in this hoard is either unique or incredibly rare. It's very hard to find any other parallels for these objects. They include things like this type of bangle and some very fine decorated mounts. And in many cases, the only parallel there is from another hoard of hack silver from Scotland, this time from slightly further to the south in Fife. This hoard is from a place called Norries Law, and like Gall Cross, it was also found in the 19th century by labourers. And like Gall Cross, most of it was lost. It was melted down and recycled soon after its discovery. What we have here is what survives, and it's just a fragment of the original. But like Gall Cross, it includes very rare or unique objects. Again, the same sort of bangle here at the front and the same sorts of decorated mounts. But unlike Gall Cross, it suffered even more damage. because in the 19th century, after it was found, all of the parcels, those carefully folded up parcels of silver, were unfolded. And so a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 3 years has been doing another jigsaw puzzle, trying to put together some of these fragments, both to understand what the objects once were, but also to understand how they had been chopped and parcelled up. So silver is really important, and it needs, it's Roman silver that's being recycled and recycled. So what are they making that silver into? You can see over here the sorts of objects that Roman silver was being melted and made into. Now, these are known as the massive silver chains, and they're really well named. The heaviest, from near Inverness in the north of Scotland, is made from 3 kilograms of solid silver. I think often when I show these to people, they think that they must be silver on a bronze or an iron core, but they're not. They're made from solid silver. 3 kilograms, as I said, in the heaviest example. They are a massive investment in terms of the most precious material in Scotland at the time. We're extremely lucky to have all 9 of the surviving chains. These are the only ones in existence, here on display together for the first time ever, thanks to a loan from the University of Aberdeen Museums. So when were they made? Probably they were made between the 4th and 5th, perhaps early 6th centuries AD, a period that's quite murky in Scotland, that crucial transition between the late Roman and the early medieval period. But none of them were found during modern excavations. All are old discoveries from the late 18th century, the 19th century, or the early 20th century. And that means that we lack the crucial archaeological context, the information about how they were buried, why they were buried, and we don't have any independent dating evidence. And that's meant that they have always been a bit of an enigma, a little bit unusual and difficult to explain. By situating these chains in Scotland's early silver, we can see how well they fit with things like the 23 kilograms of Roman hack silver from Traprain Law. And indeed, one of them, from the Scottish borders at the top, appears to have been made out of directly recycled Roman silver, suggesting that they are tied to this really important transition in the 5th century AD. So what were they used for? Well, they were worn around the neck, worn tight, like a choker necklace. And indeed, you'd have to wear it tight. With a mass of around 2 or 3 kilos, any longer than necessary, and the chains would really pull uncomfortably around your neck. They have to be tight so that you can carry the weight on your shoulders. They are, at the time they're made, the heaviest jewellery that Scotland had ever seen in any material. Several centuries earlier than this, parts of Scotland had been manufacturing massive bronze jewellery, bronze armlets and bracelets. But these are heavier still, and they're made from precious metal. So is it right to call them jewellery? Well, perhaps not, actually. It's perhaps more fitting to think of them as regalia, suitable for royalty. And indeed, the heaviest example is twice as heavy as the medieval crown of Scotland, made almost 1,000 years later. Most of them are plain, they're undecorated. And you can see that it's the material, the silver, but also the scale, the weight that's important. But 2 examples are decorated. The 2 here at the front on the left both feature designs that are, like the chains, unique to Scotland, unique to parts of Scotland. We call these the Pictish Symbols, and they are a type of script, a way of writing using pictorial symbols that is unique to parts of Scotland, as I said, and that which we can't fully understand. Unlike hieroglyphs, we don't have a Rosetta Stone that helps us crack exactly what these symbols are doing. But what we do know is that examples on portable silver objects like this are incredibly rare. There are only 3 examples known in total. Usually these symbols are found carved onto stone monuments set in the landscape and found in the northern half of Scotland. So these are incredibly rare and important objects, and as I said, it's a real honour to have all of them on display for the first time ever. So we're nearly at the end of our story of Scotland's early silver. We're nearly at the end of that 1,000 years of this material of power. So we've seen how it was arrived with the Roman world, how it was recycled and made into the most important objects found in Scotland, those massive silver chains. And recycling is a theme that's right at the heart of this exhibition, because all of the silver that you've seen until now is recycled Roman silver. And once you recycle silver, every time you recycle it, there's the opportunity to add something else into the mix. And people did that. They added small amounts of copper alloy or bronze into the melt to make those silver supplies stretch a little bit further. So the silver's becoming increasingly diluted over time. And we can see that here, in this case, in a bowl. Now this bowl was found in Shetland. It's part of a hoard of objects. And you can see today it looks almost green. And there's a very good reason for that. It's very corroded, and the corrosion is showing as green verdigris. Now that's coming from copper alloy that's in the silver alloy, and it tells us that that silver is only about 50% pure. It's about 50% silver and 50% copper alloy, and that's a big clue that silver was becoming really scarce in Scotland at this time. That is, until the Vikings arrived. The Vikings arrived from the late 8th century in Scotland, and amongst other things, they brought the first new supplies of silver bullion that Scotland had seen in 700 years. How did that silver arrive? Well, it came in the form of coins. We have here Anglo-Saxon coins and Arabic dirhams from the Islamic world, but also jewellery, brooches, and a sort of bracelet that was made in standard sizes and designed to be chopped up into small pieces. So this is the new silver bullion that's coming in and refreshing silver supplies in Scotland. So I've hoped you've enjoyed looking at the first 1,000 years of silver in Scotland with me. Our next stop is the natural world with Dr. Andrew Kitchener.
Hello, my name is Andrew Kitchener. I'm the Principal Curator of Vertebrates here at the National Museum of Scotland. And we're just standing outside the Wolfson Galleries of the Natural World, where we have all our natural science exhibitions. Now, our collections have a very long and illustrious history. Most of them date back to the early 19th century, when they were part of the University of Edinburgh's collections. But some date back even before then. And we have some that date back to the late 18th century, and there are even some that were collected in the 1690s. Now, over the years we've collected many millions of specimens, such that we have over 10 million specimens. But most of these are collected for research. There are only a few specimens which were on display, which are the very best of their kind. And so in these galleries, what we've tried to show is different aspects of the natural world. And we're particularly interested in looking at evolution and to show how the very wide diversity of life has evolved on the planet and how it's adapted to different ways of life. We also look at the geological world to show how the different geological processes are continuing to shape the surface of the Earth and create habitats and places to live for the different animal species. And we also look at the Earth's position in the universe and how it's evolved and was created many billions of years ago, and how technology has allowed us to explore the universe and find out about our origins. Well, here we are in the Animal World Gallery, and this gallery looks at how animals have evolved to adapt to different ways of life. So we look at how animals move around, what they feed upon, how they reproduce, how they fight and defend themselves, and we also look at the biggest animals that are alive on the planet today. So we're standing in front of the giraffe, which, as you all know, has a very long neck so that it can reach up to vegetation high in the trees, and it also has a very long tongue so that it can grasp hold of those leaves. But there are many other animals that evolved sometimes even more strange adaptations, and we're going to have a look at one of those now. So the animal we're going to look at is a lemur from Madagascar, but it's a very strange looking lemur. And as you can see, it looks like a giant squirrel. And in fact, when it was first discovered, it was thought to be a rodent because it has these large rodent-like teeth. And in the wild, the eye comes out at night, so it has very large eyes so it can see in the dark. And it taps its fingers along rotting branches and tree trunks to try and find hollows underneath. And it uses its big ears to detect the hollows where insect grubs are feeding. It then uses its large rodent teeth to make a hole in the bark of the tree, and then it uses its long, slender middle finger to probe inside until it can grab hold of the larva and pull it out to feed upon. You'll notice also it has claws on its feet so that it can climb around the trees without falling down. So this is one of the most unusual mammals in the world, which has these very strange adaptations for feeding on one particular kind of food. Well, here we are in the Animal Senses Gallery, which is looking at how animals sense their environment and communicate with each other. So we use our eyes to see and our ears to hear, but other animals use very different senses. They have an electrical sense, for example, for detecting electricity in the environment, or they can detect magnetism from the Earth's surface. So another thing that animals do is that they have evolved ways of confusing or deceiving other animals, which we call deception or mimicry. And an example I want to talk about is the plain pocketbook. This is a clam that lives in the freshwater rivers of North America, and it has a very fleshy exterior to the shell, which has on it a fish-shaped organ. And this fish-shaped organ, it waggles around in the water, which attracts larger fish, which think they're going to feed upon it. But the plain pocketbook has a very clever plan, because when the fish comes to bite its fleshy fold, it squirts its larvae into the gills of the fish, and the pocketbook's larvae live on the gills of the fish until they're ready to drop off and grow into adult clams. So it's a very clever example of where the clam produces a fish-like mantle which deceives a bigger fish into looking after its young. Well, here we are in the Survival Gallery, which is looking at the processes of evolution and extinction. So on one half of the gallery we present evidence for why evolution is occurring and has occurred, but on this side we look at extinction process, and particularly the impact of humans on the environment and species. And we have an example here of the quagga, which was a kind of zebra that lived in South Africa, and as you can see, it only has stripes on its neck end. It doesn't have any stripes on its body. Now, this particular quagga is a very famous specimen. It lived in London Zoo from 1851 to 1872, and it was the only quagga that was ever photographed alive, and 6 photographs were taken of it during its lifetime. Now, sadly, the quagga disappeared in 1883 when the last specimen died in Amsterdam Zoo. But recent research, we've been able to show that genetically the quagga is the same as the plain zebras of East and Southern Africa, and so its genes still survive. And there are breeding experiments going on in South Africa today to try and recreate the quagga and some of these animals are now roaming in the wild once more. So this is a good news story of an animal that was thought to have become extinct, but in fact, through careful breeding, we've been able to recreate it. You can see this rather sad-looking pigeon sitting here, which is a Mauritius blue pigeon, and it comes from the Indian Ocean island of Mauritius. And the reason it looks so sad is it's only known from 3 specimens in the world, and it became extinct in the 1830s. Now, the Mauritian blue pigeon, this particular specimen, was collected in 1800, and it came to the University of Edinburgh back in 1819, and it's been here ever since. And a lot of people say this is the best specimen that's surviving in the world, but it's still not looking very happy. Now, the Mauritius blue pigeon was hunted for meat by sailors who visited Mauritius, and also its forests were destroyed as they were cut down for timber and firewood. So this is the reason why it became extinct. Well, here we have a giant panda, and her name is Ching Ching. And she's quite a famous giant panda because she was given by the People's Republic of China to our Prime Minister Edward Heath back in the 1970s, and she lived at London Zoo. And when she died, she came here, and as you can see, we preserved her skin and we've mounted her for display. So the skin is real and the eyes are made of glass, but the inside of the body is artificial. Because we've kept her skeleton, which we keep at our collection centre down at Granton, where researchers can measure her bones. So this is a very important specimen for us because we only have a very few giant pandas here in Edinburgh.
Hi, we're here now in the Science and Technology Galleries in the National Museum of Scotland, which on 3 levels present 1,000 objects from the past, the present and the future of Scottish science and technology. We've got all manner of transport objects, as you can see. We've got aircraft, we've got rockets, we've got bicycles, but at our core are the subjects of particular Scottish industry. So behind me, as you can see, is a large stationary steam engine which would have been used to pump water in a brewery, and these were the massive structures that were built for the Industrial Revolution. We also have very precise technoscience, much more recent material, and a lot of objects that have come from Scottish Nobel Prize winners. For example, those who were involved in the development of drugs and those who were involved in physics in particular. So Peter Higgs, for example, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the boson, which is a subatomic particle. Now that, of course, you can't see, but we have evidence of all the implications of these discoveries. So what unites these galleries is the relationship between science and technology and medicine, and how they're embedded in Scottish life. So these aren't just objects for the sake of having them because they look great, although they do look great. They're here to show their social implications and how they're rooted in Scottish history and culture. A lot of people will be very familiar with the name Dunlop, which is now a company devoted to tyres and sports gear. It's associated with racing, it's associated with tennis, but fewer people know that the original name comes from John Boyd Dunlop, who was a Scottish veterinary surgeon. He was a vet, he treated animals, but he also had an interest in bicycles. Now, John Boyd Dunlop's great advance was to develop the pneumatic tyre, that is to say a rubberized, air pressure filled tyre that would serve to absorb the shocks of the roads. Now, he lived in the Victorian period in Scotland, practicing as a veterinary surgeon, but was very interested in a new development that had emerged over the course of the period that we now know as the bicycle. However, if you're in the Victorian period, the roads were very rocky and bumpy, and so riding on a bicycle with metal rims, as you can imagine, was extremely painful. And for this reason, bicycles were called bone shakers, and they were terribly uncomfortable and not particularly practical or popular. What Dunlop did was to develop the pneumatic tyre that went around the wheels, and this really developed the bicycle like it had never been used before. This meant that you could ride along a road or a bumpy track and it wouldn't be quite so painful. It wouldn't be a bone shaker anymore. And this was a phenomenal invention that took off, so that in the 1890s, where previously there'd been very few bicycles on the market, in the 1890s they exploded onto the scene, and that gave rise to a bicycling craze that went on through the early 20th century, including, for example, it enabled young women to be able to ride on their own on bicycles. So it was an extremely impactful invention in terms of its social significance, its social consequences. And that then gave rise to being used for new inventions like the motor car, and the Dunlop Company, as it became, supplied tyres for this fledgling auto industry that then went on, to be the massive multi-trillion dollar industry that it is today, down to this veterinary surgeon working in the backyard of his veterinary practice, treating animals during the day and working on his inventions at night. But the important thing to note here is that he actually reinvented the tyre. It had been another Scotsman, Robert Thomson, who 50 years earlier had invented the pneumatic tyre. He'd patented it, but because he hadn't applied it to the bicycle, because the bicycle and certainly the motor car was a long way off, and the bicycle hadn't really developed, his invention then didn't catch on in the way that Dunlop's did. So this is a very important lesson in the development of technology, that you need not only to have the idea, but have the idea at the right time. So Dunlop was able to capitalize on his idea and have this take off with the bicycle craze because of the particular time that he was able to develop it. Thomson, poor fellow, of Stonehaven in Aberdeenshire, didn't have this advantage of the timing, and so his name is forgotten in history, and it's Dunlop we associate forever with the pneumatic tyre. Even though he didn't technically invent it, he reinvented it. As far as we know, he had no knowledge of Robert Thomson's patent. He was, quite honest about this, but technically John Boyd Dunlop, famous for discovering the pneumatic tyre, didn't actually discover the pneumatic tyre. What we take pride of in National Museum Scotland is how Scottish they both were. Scotland is a hive of industry and technological development and ingenuity that continues to this day. Here we're in the gallery called Technology by Design, which shows how different technologies, different inventions and different devices have been developed from their need, through the concept, through the application. And the wonderful thing about this gallery is that it's ongoing today, and we can tell the narratives of particular kinds of technology. The case we're looking at here generally is about prosthetics. It's about how to provide limbs for people who were either born without limbs, born with short limbs, or those who lost them in accidents. So here in particular we're looking at arms, elsewhere we look at legs and hands and so on. And what we like about this particular part of the collection is it goes right through history. We start off with the most simple of devices and take them through the story of the development of this particular technology, and looking in particular at how Scotland has contributed to this story. So one of my favourite items in the museum is the EMAS arm, which is in the middle of the display just here. This is the Edinburgh Modular Arm System. Now this was developed by a surgeon and engineer called David Gow and his colleagues here in Edinburgh, hence EMAS. And it was revolutionary in developing the sort of prosthetic limbs that people are able to use today. The EMAS system came out of a company that was working in Edinburgh, out of the hospitals in Edinburgh, that had started by looking at how to provide the survivors of the thalidomide tragedy in the early 1960s. This was when a drug was given to pregnant mothers that had an impact on the children who were then born, that meant that they had either foreshortened limbs or no limbs at all. So the Edinburgh group began by trying to design whole systems that would provide these children as they grew up with arms that they could use, full-length arms and full-length legs. However, these were powered by steam, they were very noisy, they were very heavy, they were very uncomfortable. And actually what's interesting is that a lot of these patients, these users, chose not to go forward with this technology because it was so heavy. So, knowing this, the engineers and the surgeons kept on working and made more comfortable, more convenient, more sophisticated devices. And this is where the Edinburgh Modular Arm System came in the 1990s with David Gow and his team. Now this device here, this prosthetic, was developed from the larger, more cumbersome systems that had been developed previously by Keith Simpson and his colleagues. But this modular system was the first to be really user-friendly. It was still heavy and still cumbersome, but lighter and could still respond. So this was used by a publican, a pub owner who lost his arm to cancer, and he was able to don this arm and use it in a convenient way. It was still difficult, but it was better than the systems that had come before. And what we like about the sort of stories we can tell here at the National Museum of Scotland is we then bring the story forward. We go from the early Simpson limbs to the Edinburgh Modular Arm System right through to what we call the I-limb today. And these hands at the bottom here are becoming very sophisticated. They can respond to the nerves of the patient. They can do clasping motions, which is very simple, and we take for granted, those of us who have two hands, but is actually incredibly difficult to achieve in a prosthetic. And what's exciting is we're still working with the company that emerged from the Edinburgh Modular Arm System and working with them to provide us with the prototypes of the prosthetics that they're developing today. And this, the I-limb, is where we've got to so far. This was acquired for the new galleries which opened in 2016, so right up to date. I will continue to work with the company to collect prototypes as the technology develops and as the technology improves. So here in Edinburgh, we've had pioneers of prosthetic technology, and we continue to be pioneering in prosthetic technology. And we'll carry on gathering them, we'll carry on collecting for now, for the future. So here in the Science and Technology galleries at National Museum Scotland, we have very crude early technology, early steam engines, locomotives, but we go right up from these primitive beginnings of technology to the most cutting edge science you can possibly imagine. And this we take to be particle physics. Now, as in all things, Scotland has leading figures in these areas and has done ever since the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century. But more recently, Scotland has paid a particular contribution to the study of subatomic particles. Now, what we have here is a very striking looking instrument. It's large, it's very complicated, and it's part of the CERN nuclear physics project in Switzerland. Now you might ask why there might be a European instrument in a Scottish gallery. It's because this was a collaborative endeavour that involved scientists from across the world. They built a massive particle accelerator. So this item here is just one accelerating cavity of 24 cavities around a 2-kilometre ring, over a kilometre round, that would accelerate particles and smash them against each other. And when you smash subatomic particles together, they produce all manner of interesting results. They produce a lot of energy, but they also show you what's hidden within the secrets of the atom, right at the core of matter itself. So this large electron-positron collider was used to smash electrons and positrons together. Now the reason we have it is that it came out of use in the late 1990s, and parts of this equipment were distributed around the world, and my colleagues were fortunate enough to visit the facility and to pick out this particular copper cavity to show to visitors and the people of Scotland the contribution of this extraordinary experiment. Now at CERN, they replaced the large electron-positron collider with the Large Hadron Collider. Now this then looked even further into the secrets of the atom, into subatomic particles. And famously, the Large Hadron Collider then proved the existence of bosons, the Higgs boson, which was a particle that had been predicted by a young Scottish physicist, Peter Higgs, based here in Edinburgh, who predicted that there would be a subatomic particle, a boson, because of the theoretical background, the theoretical calculations he was able to make way back 50 years ago. What the team at CERN proved with the successor to this instrument, the Large Hadron Collider, what the team were able to prove was indeed there was experimental evidence for the Higgs boson. And for this, Peter Higgs won a Nobel Prize in physics. And he was one of several Scottish Nobel Prize winners that we're proud to display the work of in these galleries, the science and technology galleries. So what we're able to show in these galleries is not only the technological ingenuity of Scottish engineers, not only the life-saving medicines of Scottish doctors, but also the theoretical and experimental advances made by Scottish scientists, right from James Clerk Maxwell and Lord Kelvin in the Victorian period, through the 20th century to Peter Higgs, through the 21st century, where the Large Hadron Collider that replaced the Large Electron-Positron Collider at CERN was able to make these discoveries. Now what I personally like about this wonderful piece of apparatus is that it's not only a scientific marvel, it's not only part of a massive multinational experiment, it's also very beautiful. So we in the science department like it for its technological advances. Our colleagues, the curators in the art and design department, admire it for its sculptural qualities. And that's the wonderful thing about having a multidisciplinary organisation like National Museum of Scotland, is we're able to juxtapose sculpture and art and nature with really beautiful, important pieces of scientific apparatus like the copper accelerating cavity from the Large Electron-Positron Collider at CERN. I'm standing here with perhaps our most iconic, our most famous object amongst all of the 12.5 million objects in our collections. This one object attracts more attention and is more famous than all the others. This is Dolly the Sheep. Technically, actually, it's only Dolly the Sheep's skin laid over a mannequin, because this is a taxidermic mount. But in shorthand we say this is Dolly the Sheep. Now Dolly is a very important, very famous Edinburgh story, because Dolly is the first animal cloned from adult tissues. Now this was an absolute breakthrough. In 1996, when Dolly was born to a surrogate mother, a sheep of a slightly different breed. And this is very striking and very important because it showed that adult cloning could take place. So Dolly was born after research at the Roslin Institute near Edinburgh, working with scientists from around the world. She was born in 1996 and showed that adult cloning could take place. Now, Dolly then lived until 2003. Now this is a relatively short lifespan for a sheep, but still she had a happy and healthy life. She developed arthritis towards the end of her life. It's difficult to know whether that was because she was cloned or whether that was in general because of something that would have happened anyway, something we call idiopathic, a condition that would have come along. Now, what's really interesting about the science behind Dolly is that in 1996, that is to say 21 years ago, she would have had her 21st birthday this year. In 1996, this was taken to be a massive innovation that was going to allow for a lot of cloning activity to take place. However, as you will have noticed, we are not awash with cloned animals because the devices, the techniques that were then used by biomedical scientists in Scotland here as elsewhere moved more towards stem cell research. This is where the genetic and the medical advances can come from. Not from cloning from an adult, but rather from the pre-embryonic cells. So although Dolly and Dolly's birth and life was a fantastic technological scientific advance, actually it did show that this was not the scientific route that biomedical science and cloning was going to take. So Dolly, in fact, was a technological road that was then not travelled on. And we've taken other paths with other techniques instead of carrying on this sort of technique. It was very, very important though, and she became very iconic. There are other clone mates of hers that have been farmed and developed since then, but it's Dolly who was the first adult cell cloned organism who then was born naturally from a sheep mother and then grew to be this rather handsome looking ovine we see before us today. And she stands here in the middle of the Science and Technology galleries at National Museum Scotland, where she's utterly iconic and is enjoyed by 2 million visitors a year. Dolly the Sheep. So, we hope you've enjoyed our tour of National Museum Scotland. You've seen Scottish history, you've seen nature, you've seen science and technology. We also have whole museums devoted to rural life and farming, a museum devoted to aviation, and a museum devoted to military history, as well as you'll have seen, our massive collection stores. But of all our 12.4 million items, we've only been able to show you a very few. We hope you'll be able to come and visit us to see many of these wonderful things for yourselves. We constantly change our exhibitions and our displays, and we hope you'll come and experience something new at National Museum Scotland here in Edinburgh.